and welcome to this week's study of the book of Daniel. We've reached chapters 7 and 8. Kind of a strange way to start a Bible study video, a video of a ram and goat fighting each other. Why would we start a lesson that way? Well, we've reached the second half of the book of Daniel. And the second half of the book of Daniel is not as much history, and it's more so visions and prophecy. And some of these visions and prophecies just are so mysterious and confusing, and you maybe read a section, you think, what did I just read? And some of those visions we'll cover today, including the ram and the goat fighting. Why does God use visions? Why did he give dreams like this to Daniel? Well, I think a big part of it is that it really helps root these concepts, these promises, these warnings in our head. God attaches them to these very memorable graphics, and it sticks with us in a way that maybe it wouldn't if God just said, here's what's going to happen for the rest of humanity's history until Jesus comes back. God attaches them to these very beautiful, violent, mysterious images, and it really sticks with us in a way that is powerful. You see the picture here on the screen is an image that says the Ancient of Days. That's really what we should remember as we go through these visions today, that God is the Ancient of Days. It's a title he receives in chapter 7. It's the only place in the Bible he's called the Ancient of Days, but it's a great title, one that emphasizes his permanence, that he is ancient. He's from of old. He's always been around, and then you put of days on there, and you think days are a sign of impermanence. The days go by. Our life just sort of slips by us. A lot of those concepts in Ecclesiastes were about how quickly life goes, and life is just this breath here on this earth. So God is the Ancient of Days. He is eternal, in contrast to how temporary and how brief this life is. And when we think about this life and the struggles that we face, and sometimes the chaos our world or our country endures, it's good to remember the Ancient of Days is in control. Our objectives for today: give one concrete way that God demonstrates his sovereignty in this chapter, and then make one application from this text regarding our attitude each day. Okay, the introduction. Imagine that people involved in World War II knew exactly how things would turn out in the end, but could not change anything. What would be different? What would be the same, do you think? So people involved in World War II, that would be all these different governments, all the leaders of these governments: Winston Churchill, FDR, Harry Truman, Adolf Hitler. What would be different for them? What about the citizens of their countries? What would be different? What would be the same? Just some images from that time. This is firefighters working to put out fires in London after another bombing run by the Axis powers. Just think of how brutal it was to live there, and every day to think this might be our last day on Earth. We're not safe here in this city. We're not even on the battlefield. We're not in a war zone, but they've made our city a war zone. I think of when the Americans got involved after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and what a shocking thing that was to realize, okay, the Japanese military, they could come and reach us. We're not safe from them. They're not too far away. That they can bring the battle to our home. Adolf Hitler, history rightly recognizes him as an incredibly evil man, but what if he knew that there was no chance that he could win? Certainly his arrogance and his confidence were part of the reason that he did what he did. But what if he couldn't change things and knew, even as he was making all these efforts, that he couldn't possibly win, that he was doomed to die, and his Nazi government was doomed to fail in the end? How would that have changed things? One of the lasting images of these soldiers in the Pacific Theater, island of Iwo Jima, raising the flag, just how difficult those battles were in that Pacific Theater, and just the people that we lost, the good soldiers that we lost, and the courage that they showed in doing that, and finally leading up to victory. So what would be the same? Well, I think the heartache would be the same, the loss would be the same, some of the grief would be the same. But what would be different? Well, the attitude of these people as they went through these tough things, knowing that victory was coming, they could be confident. They could have hope, even as they endured loss and tragedy and hardship. They knew that victory was inevitable. How would that feel for Hitler, as he knew that his defeat was inevitable? Well, it certainly would make him rage and whatever else, but ultimately he knew it was all worthless, that he would be defeated. As we think about these visions today, we realize that God is in 100% total control. He is sovereign. He is almighty. And what does that mean for us? Well, even as we go through hard things, and these visions in chapter 7 and 8 have hard things in store for God's people, we know that victory is assured, that God is in control. That's the final message of these visions. These terrible beasts show up and do powerful, scary, intimidating things, but ultimately they're defeated. So God is in control. Satan knows that his defeat is inevitable. So how frustrating it is for him to feel like he's gaining all these victories in this world, and yet still to know in the end, God will defeat him. The Ancient of Days will stand on his throne, will open the books and destroy the devil, and send him to eternal punishment forever. So with those concepts in mind, let's begin with our first section, the first 14 verses of Daniel 7. The first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream, and visions passed through his mind as he was lying in bed. He wrote down the substance of his dream. Daniel said, "In my vision at night I looked, and there before me were the four winds of heaven churning up the great sea. Four great beasts, each different from the others, came up out of the sea. The first was like a lion, and it had the wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground, so that it stood on 2 feet like a human being, and the mind of a human was given to it. And there before me was a second beast, which looked like a bear. It was raised up on one of its sides, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, 'Get up and eat your fill of flesh.' After that I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard, and on its back it had 4 wings like those of a bird. This beast had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule. After that, in my vision at night I looked, and there before me was a 4th beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts, and it had 10 horns. While I was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little one, which came up among them, and the 3 of its first horns were uprooted before it. The horn had eyes like the eyes of a human being, and a mouth that spoke boastfully." Okay, right out of the gate, we have some crazy stuff going on in this vision. So Daniel is really receiving this vision from God. This is, previously Daniel has been interpreting dreams for people, right? In this case, he's actually the one receiving the vision, which is an interesting shift in perspective. Maybe just setting the stage a little bit. So what is happening in terms of the timing of this? Well, we should note that chapter 7 actually takes place before chapter 5. So if you remember from last week's lesson in Daniel 6, the Persians had taken over. Darius or Cyrus was the leader of the Persian government and had overthrown the Babylonians, and that really had happened at the end of verse 5 or chapter 5 too, right? Belshazzar had that dream or the vision of the handwriting on the wall, and that very night the Persians overtook the Babylonians. So we're now going back in time, which is a little bit confusing. So when this happens, Daniel is 65 years old probably, and the Babylonians and Belshazzar are still in control. So that's why in this vision the Babylonians are described here as still being in power. We mentioned at the start, the second half of the book is a little different than the first. There's sort of a reversal. Chapters 1 and 6, we had a lot of history. We had the 3 men in the fiery furnace. We had Daniel in the lion's den. We had Daniel and these, his fellow young Jews being taken from their homeland into Babylon. Now, chapter 7 to 12, it's a big shift. We have this prophecy and just a little bit of history, so keep that in mind as we go. Let's talk a little bit about those 4 animals. There's a lion with the wings of an eagle, which is an interesting image to us. But you think the lion is often described as the king in the jungle, and the eagle is sort of thought of as being sort of the chief of the birds. So you have strength and you have flight. So an animal that has strength and flight would be able to conquer powerfully and quickly. And certainly the Babylonians did this. Their empire was widespread. They were able to really dominate. This is an interesting image, a strange image to us, a lion with wings, but not for the Babylonians. In fact, archaeologists have found lions with wings kind of all over the city of Babylon. So this is very easily easily seen as a reference to Babylon, because this is sort of their animal, the winged lion. So you have the winged lion here being lifted up, and its wings are torn off, which shows that this Babylonian government would be overthrown by the next animal. And of course, we see that in the book of Daniel, that the Persians did take over for the Babylonians. And it's thought, this isn't necessarily for sure, but there's that verse at the end of verse 4, it says the mind of a human was given to it. That could be a reference to Daniel chapter 4. If you remember that, Nebuchadnezzar, as a consequence from God for his pride, was sent out into the wilderness, and he thought of himself as a beast. So after Nebuchadnezzar was appropriately humbled, he was restored and he thought as a person again. So this could be a reference to that the mind of a human was given back to this animal. But we don't know for sure. Second animal is a bear coming out of the sea. So this is a second empire. All four of these are empires, these animals. And you'll notice a lot of similarities to chapter 2 and the vision that Nebuchadnezzar was given of the statue. If you remember that, there was a statue with the 4 different metals, and we identified them as the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, and the Roman Empire. And this is the exact same. It's now just God is giving this vision to Daniel instead of Nebuchadnezzar. Now the bear, we would say that represents the Persians, or the Medo-Persians. It's described as bears having one side is higher and more powerful than the other. That would really fit the Medo-Persian Empire. That Cyrus had taken this other country, this other kind of entity, the land of Media, and combined forces with his Persian government. So Media had been around earlier, but they never rose to the heights of power that Persia did. So they're joining together. It's not like Cyrus is defeating Media, but they're just joining forces together. But of the two, Persia is definitely more powerful, so that gives us the one side higher than the other. The bear has 3 ribs in its mouth. It's thought that could be the 3 major conquests that the Medo-Persians, enjoyed or won, the conquest of Lydia, Babylon, and Egypt. Third beast is a leopard with 4 wings. So what do we notice about the leopard? Well, that's twice as many wings as the lion, eagle. A leopard is an animal that is faster than a lion typically would be. So we would say this is the Greek Empire. So smaller in the sense that the Greek army was much smaller. You have a note there. Alexander the Great's army had 50,000 men, yet conquered most of the known world. So they're smaller but faster. They're able to really move across the known world in a span of about 12 years. Alexander and his sleek, smaller army is able to conquer much of the known world. The 4 heads of the leopard could indicate Greece was partitioned among Alexander's commanders after his death, 4 different commanders. So it makes sense that this leopard has 4 heads, because you have the 1 becomes 4. In chapter 8, we'll talk a little bit more about Greece. Just a note here, it's said that Daniel's vision, they were given authority to rule. That can only be God's power. You've got a quote from this author Feinberg from a book about Daniel. No other explanation can account for the fact that Alexander's 30,000 man army was able to conquer Persian armies of several hundreds of thousands. When Alexander the Great took his forces into Persia, they had 30,000 people, and the Persian army was much, much larger. So we would point to this as a sign that God allowed the Greeks to overtake these Persians. The odds were not in their favor. So again, this would be a time we would see the hand of God in action in world history. Now the last beast, I don't know. Here's an artist's rendition of what that beast might have looked like, which is incredibly creepy. But it doesn't correlate with any animal that we know here on this earth. It's just is terrifying. And Daniel's reaction to it in this vision and the second vision, he's horrified by it, and he wants to know what's going on with this fourth beast. We would say this represents the Roman Empire. The iron teeth, you might remember that from the iron material in the chapter 2 statue. The Roman Empire was the iron at the bottom. And it has 10 horns, which could reference the fact that Rome, after it fell, was completely split up. If you turn to your second page, we have an activity that we'll do in our Zoom meetings, and you can think about it now. Explain why God may have decided to give Daniel another vision about these 4 empires, despite prophesying about them in chapter 2. So think about that a little bit. Daniel already had received this message through Nebuchadnezzar's dream, loud and clear, that this is what was going to happen. Why would God do this again? And really, why would he do this in 2 separate chapters now, 2 different visions? Think about that. Let's read our next section. As I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was as white as snow. The hair of his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened. Then I continued to watch, because of the boastful words the horn was speaking. I kept looking until the beast was slain, and its body destroyed and thrown into the blazing fire. The other beasts had been stripped of their authority, but were allowed to live for a period of time. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. We should note here that a lot of the imagery in these sections is similar to what we find in Revelation. The book of Daniel and the book of Revelation are very connected in terms of what they're talking about, the power of the government, the power of the Antichrist, and how God overrules them all and guards and blesses his church throughout all of this. Another point to make is just this is God showing up here. We've got a courtroom scene, which is very intense and also great. Number 2 says, list 1 or 2 reasons why it's so satisfying to have God show up in this way at this time, and it really is. Well, think about that. Why is it so satisfying to have God show up after these animals and do what he does? We'll talk about that more then. You also might remember Vicar Plucker preached on part of this text. I believe that was for Last Judgment Sunday, and we had the Son of Man coming in the clouds. We'll talk about in our Zoom meetings reasons why we would identify this Son of Man as Jesus Christ, the Messiah. So you can be thinking about that too. But you just have these terrible beasts who are horrifying, and who shows up to corral them and judge them? It's the Almighty God. So give some thought to that, why that is incredibly comforting. Maybe just but one more thing before we move on is to consider how God looks here, how Jesus looks here. There's this fire, strength, power, majesty, transcendence. As I'm recording this video, it's the weekend we're going to celebrate Transfiguration Sunday in worship, the Sunday in which Jesus shines like the sun and you see his real power as God. So connect that Transfiguration account to this account to see this is who God really is. This is what he truly looks like, this fire and holiness and purity and awe. That's helps us understand Jesus' passion even more and appreciate it even more, that this is who Jesus is. He is the Son of Man coming in the clouds. He is holy and powerful and can do whatever he wants, and yet he chooses to become a carpenter from Nazareth and to allow himself to be spat upon and mocked and finally crucified. That shows you how much God loves us. All right, let's get to the interpretation of the dream. So, I, Daniel, was troubled in spirit, and the visions that passed through my mind disturbed me, which is completely understandable, right? Can you imagine having this vision and having these things sort of play out in front of you and how overwhelming that would be? Verse 16, I approached one of those standing there and asked him the meaning of all this. Daniel approaches an angel and just says, I don't understand what's going on here. So he told me and gave the interpretation of these things. The 4 great beasts are 4 kings that will rise from the earth. But the holy people of the Most High will receive the kingdom and will possess it forever. Yes, forever and ever. Then I wanted to know the meaning of the 4th beast, which was different than all the others, and most terrifying, with its iron teeth and bronze claws. The beast that crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. I also wanted to know about the 10 horns on its head, and about the other horn that came up, before which 3 of them fell, the horn that looked more imposing than the others, and that had eyes and a mouth and spoke boastfully. As I watched, this horn was waging war against the holy people and defeating them, until, that is, the Ancient of Days came and pronounced judgment in favor of the holy people of the Most High, and the time came when they possessed the kingdom. He gave me this explanation. The 4th beast is the 4th kingdom that will appear on earth. It will be different from all the other kingdoms, and will devour the whole earth, trampling it down and crushing it. The 10 horns are 10 kings who will come from this kingdom. After them another king will arise, different from the earlier ones. He will subdue 3 kings. He will speak against the Most High and oppress his holy people, and try to change the set times and the laws. The holy people will be delivered into his hands for a time, times, and half a time. But the court will sit, and his power will be taken away and completely destroyed forever. Then the sovereignty, power, and greatness of all the kingdoms under heaven will be handed over to the holy people of the Most High. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all rulers will worship and obey him. This is the end of the matter. I, Daniel, was deeply troubled by my thoughts, and my face turned pale, but I kept the matter to myself. Okay, that was a lot of text at once, but it's essentially just explaining the vision, especially that fourth kingdom, which we'll talk more in depth during our Zoom meeting. But just you have this little horn that is somehow has human intelligence, and it's taking up the influence of three other horns, which shows you that some descendant of the Roman Empire is going to have an inordinate amount of influence over God's people, but God remains in control. Just a word about that concept, time, times, and half a time. That likely stands for 3.5 years. So time would be 1 year. Times is 2 years, so that's 3. And half a time is 3.5. So we can't pin down 100% what that 3.5 years would mean, but some thoughts are that it's half of 7, which is the number of God in the covenant. We talked about that in previous chapters, that you've got the triune God, the four corners of the universe. So those 3 and 4 together are 7. So 3.5 that this little horn is able to operate could stand for the fact that it's only half as powerful as God, although it wants to be God. Or it could be not quite 4. Again, that 4 usually represents universality. So the 4 is complete. So 3.5 means it's almost complete, but it's not forever. So God could be emphasizing here that although things are going to be hard when this little horn is doing its work, it's not going to last forever. Just a word about that little horn. Again, we'll talk about that more in the Zoom meetings. But this little horn waged war against God's people. It's described as speaking against the Most High and claiming authority only he possessed. And it tries to change the set times and laws, which is really to set aside the divine will. How do we see that little horn in action? Well, one of the big ways we would see it is in the Church of Luther's day. So what did the Church of Luther's day do? Well, they oppressed God's people. They changed so much of what the Bible said, made it about your actions rather than God's grace. Through the use of indulgences, they're taking money from the people and using it to build their fancy cathedrals and things like that. So you have the Church of Luther's day really claiming to speak in God's place and changing rules. So we would see in this prophecy, we would see a fulfillment in the Church of Luther's day, and really in some ways the Roman Catholic leadership. In terms of how they feel about Scripture and what they did to God's people. But again, the assurance is that God is in control and they will not be able to thwart God's people forever. All right, let's move on to chapter 8 in Daniel's next vision. In the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign, I, Daniel, had a vision, after the one that had already appeared to me. In my vision, I saw myself in the citadel of Susa in the province of Elam. In the vision, I was beside the Ulai Canal. I looked up, and there before me was a ram with 2 horns, standing beside the canal, and the horns were long. One of the horns was longer than the other, but grew up later. I watched the ram as it charged toward the west and the north and the south. No animal could stand against it, and none could rescue from its power. It did as it pleased, and it became great. As I was thinking about this, suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between its eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. Came toward the 2-horned ram I had seen standing beside the canal and charged at it in great rage. I saw it attack the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattering its 2 horns. The ram was powerless to stand against it. The goat knocked it to the ground and trampled on it, and none could rescue the ram from its power. The goat became very great, but at the height of its power the large horn was broken off, and in its place 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. You have a second vision that's taking place years later. Where is this taking place? Well, Daniel says he sees himself in Susa. You see that on the map. I can make this bigger for a second here. So you've got the city of Babylon toward the west there, the left, and then Susa is circled right in the middle. And Daniel says that he sees himself there, which would indicate that he's not there in body, but he is there in spirit. So God apparently had whisked Daniel over to this place in spirit to receive this vision. Just a note about Susa. Susa ended up being sort of a summer palace for the Persians, so it's a fitting place for Daniel to have this vision. Remember, Babylon at this time of his vision, we're still before chapter 5, so Babylonians are still in control. Belshazzar is still in control, but very soon the Persian government will override and overtake Babylon. So it's fitting that Daniel has this vision in Susa, because this is going to become sort of a stronghold for the Persians themselves. Ram versus goat. We started this video with a short clip of ram and goat fighting. Here we have Medo-Persia versus Greece, so the ram versus the goat. Again, the Medo-Persians that you have, the one horn where was that? Verse 3, one of the horns was longer than the other but grew up later. So that really seems to fit with Medo-Persia, as we talked about earlier in this video. The Media had been around earlier, so they had been around longer, but the Persians were stronger. So the horn that was shorter but grew up earlier, that would be Media, and the horn that grew up later but was longer, that would be Persia. Which, that you've got this ram that is running all over the place, in all directions of the compass, and very successful for a time. And that really was, the Persians really did dominate for a long time until Greece showed up, until this goat, the smaller animal showed up. We said before, Alexander attacked the Persian Empire with 30,000 men in 334 BC. So this small, quicker, more agile animal in the goat is able to overtake, we think of a ram being larger and more powerful. And that really is what Greece did. Greece came and knocked down Persia. But the goats, right at the height of the goat's power, its horn is broken off. And we would say, well, that's really fits Alexander the Great, right? He was at the height of his power and prestige. He died of a fever, I think, at age 33. So that fits this goat very well. The four horns of the goat that replaced the one horn, this fits very well with Greece too, because after Alexander's death, there was a couple years of instability as his four generals really wrestled with who was going to take over for him, and eventually the four of them just received different sections of the Greek Empire. So the four horns fits very well here. Okay, let's get into the next section. Out of one of them came another horn. So out of one of these four horns comes another, which started small but grew in power to the south and to the east and toward the beautiful land. We'll talk about that in a second. It grew until it reached the host of the heavens, and it threw some of the starry hosts down to the earth and trampled on them. It set itself up to be as great as the commander of the army of the Lord. It took away the daily sacrifice from the Lord, and his sanctuary was thrown down. Because of rebellion, the Lord's people and the daily sacrifice were given over to it. It prospered in everything it did, and truth was thrown to the ground. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to him, how long will it take for the vision to be fulfilled? The vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the rebellion that causes desolation, the surrender of the sanctuary, and the trampling underfoot of the Lord's people. He said to me, it will take 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated. Boy, this section is really interesting. That replacement, so you've got these four horns, we've still got that on the screen. Out of one of these horns comes another horn, a smaller horn. We would say that really fits with Antiochus Epiphanes IV, who was the ruler of the Seleucids from 175 to 164 BC. So just to go back, you've got these four guys here, these four generals, and each of them receives a portion of the Greek Empire. So out of that, Seleucus, you have the Seleucids here. Antiochus Epiphanes is from that empire, and he did attack what we would call the beautiful land, which is Israel. He really had it in for the Israelites and attacked them quite a bit. So the beautiful land there that's being attacked by this little horn, that really fits well with Israel and God's people being the starry host that he's bringing down low or destroying them. It talks a lot about the sacrifices being stopped. Antiochus Epiphanes did that. He desecrated the temple and stopped the daily sacrifices. He went into the temple in Jerusalem and stopped all these things. And one of the things that really stood out that he did that was so blasphemous before God, he took the altar of God out and put an altar to the god Jupiter in there. So here's what a statue of Jupiter may have looked like. Jupiter really, in the Greek god system, matches up with Zeus in the Roman god system. A few more things about Antiochus Epiphanes. He burnt the books of Moses that were in the temple. So that would really correspond with truth being thrown to the ground in this section. He called himself as great as the prince of the host. So that matches up really well with Antiochus Epiphanes, this little horn here, sort of claiming to have the same power as God. And he killed more than 100,000 Jews. Antiochus Epiphanes is still well known in the Jewish community because he's the main villain in the celebration of Hanukkah. And the Maccabees and the books of 1st and 2nd Maccabees really talk about how the Jews were able to rise up and defend their land. And really, Antiochus Epiphanes, it says that he was thrown from a chariot as a judgment from God. We don't know entirely if that's the way it happened or not. But at a time when it felt like Antiochus Epiphanes should have kept going and should have become more powerful and kept destroying the Israelites, he did die. Whether that was being thrown from a chariot in an accident, which is what 2nd Maccabees says, or whether it was just, he had an unexplained sudden death. We don't know for sure, but either way, he was cut short. This part is really interesting, this detail. So the 2,300 evenings and mornings, That would be about the number of sacrifices consecutively offered on 1,150 days in the temple. Can we say this is what it means for sure? No, but it really fits interestingly. And this would fit the interval between the desecration of the altar on Kislev, which matches up with our November in 168 BC, and the reconsecration of the altar, November 25th, 165 BC. So there's about 3 years. 1,095 days would be pretty much exactly 3 years going by. This is where it gets kind of interesting. So that altar to Jupiter, the god Jupiter, was placed in God's temple about 2 months before the altar of God was desecrated and removed. So you add 2 months to 1,095 and you get 1,150 days. So you would have essentially 1,150 days between the time when the altar to Jupiter was installed in the temple and the time when it was removed and God's altar was reconsecrated. So this does seem to fit very well. And again, you see how God just works everything out for our good and the good of his people, even if things are tough for a time. All right, let's finish up with the interpretation of the vision. While I, Daniel, was watching the vision and trying to understand it, there before me stood one who looked like a man. And I heard a man's voice from the Ulai calling, "Gabriel, tell this man the meaning of the vision." That's interesting right there. It's a small detail, but it's important. The Ulai is a river, so it appears that God's voice, the voice of God itself, is coming from the river and telling Angel Gabriel. Remember, Angel Gabriel is the one who made the announcement to Mary that she would be pregnant with the Son of God. So Gabriel makes an appearance here. Verse 17. As he came near the place where I was standing, I was terrified and fell prostrate. "Son of man," he said to me, "understand that the vision concerns the time of the end." While he was speaking to me, I was in a deep sleep with my face to the ground. Then he touched me and raised me to my feet. He said, "I'm going to tell you what will happen later in the time of wrath, because the vision concerns the appointed time of the end. The two-horned ram that you saw represents the kings of Media and Persia. The shaggy goat is the king of Greece, and the large horn between its eyes is the first king. The 4 horns that replace the one that was broken off represent 4 kingdoms that will emerge from his nation, but will not have the same power. In the latter part of their reign, when rebels have become completely wicked, a fierce-looking king, a master of intrigue, will arise. He will become very strong, but not by his own power. He will cause astounding devastation, and will succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy those who are mighty, the holy people. He will cause deceit to prosper, and he will consider himself superior. When they feel secure, he will destroy many and take his stand against the prince of princes. Yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. The vision of the evenings and mornings that has been given you is true, but seal up the vision, for it concerns the distant future. I, Daniel, was worn out. I lay exhausted for several days. Then I got up and went about the king's business. I was appalled by the vision. It was beyond understanding. So that's the end of 2 chapters of visions here. Maybe one thing to note is it's rare that in the Bible with these visions we get such direct mention of political powers and their fulfillment of these prophecies. But we have that here, that the angel Gabriel points out Media and Persia and Greece directly and says this is what's going to happen, which is amazing that God calls his shot here before it happens, that these empires will rise and fall. Remember, at this point that this vision takes place, Babylon is still very much a world power. So the idea of that Media and Persia would overtake it and that Greece would overtake them, that's astounding that that's in here. We'll talk more about the content of this vision, which really matches up many aspects of the first vision, but just a few things to consider before we're done here. Daniel's attitude, just the being overwhelmed by God's presence and by this vision, just consider whether that's healthy or not. And then the final end of it, so that Daniel's told to seal up the vision, which is to say, write it down. Make sure that future generations can see or can read about what you saw, because it's important. This vision's not just for you, Daniel. It's for the exiles. It's for the people who are back in Jerusalem now after Cyrus will send them home. It's for us today in 2021. And then finally, that Daniel is exhausted from this vision, but then gets up and goes about his business. All right, that's the end of this video. Hopefully you did understand or receive that concept that God still is majorly in control, even as these things are terrible and chaotic and violent. You've got these beasts showing up from the sea. You have these 2 beasts, the ram and goat, fighting each other, and just all the damage that happens because of them, all the spiritual warfare that happens. God remains in control. In the end, the Ancient of Days is sitting on his throne. The books are open. He makes his judgment and carries out that judgment. Okay, hopefully we'll see you for the Zoom classes on Wednesday at 10 and Thursday at 7. God's blessings to you.